Well, hello everybody. Steve the Amateur Historian. I'm in the Old Town Albina area, kind of where the city, when it was its own individual city, is kind of platted. It's all kind of through here. I want to make it known, before I get into the subject of today's video, that while murder is never a lighthearted thing, this video in particular may be a little bit more troubling to viewers than other ones I've done because of the victim and the victim's age regarded in this case. So I'm giving you that disclaimer now. If you have a sensitive stomach, maybe this isn't the one for you, and you may want to pop on another video I did. That said, hi everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, and this is a fresh episode of Historic Murders of Portland. And of course, right on cue, it was very quiet around here until I decided to start videoing. And then all that crap started happening. But fortunately, this Widmer Brewing building will hopefully give me some protection. So for the sake of this video, taking you back to the morning of March 15th, 1911. This location right here, well, this is, Old Town Albina, what still exists of kind of the old town. This intersection right here, which is very bright to you right now, but it's Mississippi is the crossing street, and then this is Russell that I'm on. And roughly near this intersection, right across the street, there was a sort of a rooming house, boarding house, whatever you'd want to call it. And pretty much all buildings of this make followed the classic style of the first floor level would usually be businesses of some kind, small ones, and then upstairs would be hotel space, apartments, rooms to rent, short-term, long-term. And there either is or was a rooming house near this intersection over here. Across the street here, this would be the northwest corner of Russell and Mississippi. And I'm not 100% certain whether the location where this crime took place is still here, but for whatever the case, I'll get into that in a second. So a 5-year-old girl, named Barbara Holzman, was sent by her parents. This just kind of shows you, just 1911, it was a whole other world. 5-year-old girl gets sent by her parents alone to go to the corner meat market to pick up some meat for her family. Her whichever parent it was gave her 15 cents to go get the meat. She was supposed to just go there and come back. And she lived on Borthwick Street, which actually crosses Russell about 4 or 5 blocks east of here. She lived on Borthwick near Fremont. So she would have lived a little ways north, some 10, 12 blocks north of here. So it's unknown exactly what happened to a absolute degree, but what we do know is that she left her family's home to go to the meat market. She doesn't return home, and it's March 15th here at the rooming house at near this intersection, that a woman named Bertha Nelson, who was the proprietor of this particular rooming house that was over here, came into the room. She either knew it had been vacated or was under the assumption that it had been vacated. And as she came in to, turn things over, prepare it for the next customer, she apparently pulled the blankets back from the bed, and there she found the body of 5-year-old Barbara Holzman, kind of stuffed under the bed, as it would be reported. She'd been stuffed under the bed of this rooming house. It appeared she had died of strangulation of some kind, so whatever the circumstances were, it was obvious that Barbara Holzman had been grabbed off the street somewhere between here and her home, a little ways this direction. It was believed by law enforcement that she was probably walking along Mississippi Avenue here and was grabbed somewhere along this street, and conveniently the rooming house would have been right here, and obviously whoever grabbed her murdered her and left her behind to be found the next day. And all we had to go on in the aftermath of this case, because it seems there was no evidence left behind, no fingerprints, no items that could be traced back to somebody else. All we had to go on was Bertha Nelson's general information about who rented that room. She said the guy was a stranger to her, he'd never been there before, she didn't know his name. So there in and of itself, that's nothing much to go on. And all she really had to say was that the guy was older. I even read in a newspaper the man was described as elderly, which it's important to make a distinction between elderly now and elderly 100 years ago. By saying elderly, this guy could have been in his 50s, maybe pushing 60. Not necessarily what we'd regard as elderly now. But obviously the guy checked in. Nelson got at least something of a look at the guy. So there was a little bit of something to go on. And, well, I mean, for the authorities, it was the only thing to go on. They had to start combing the area for anybody who remotely fit that bill. I mean, this was the brutal murder of a girl who was just past the point of infancy, practically. I mean, this girl, kindergarten age. So this was taken very seriously. The day before she was found, when she vanished, the whole city went into a panic. Everybody was searching. Nobody obviously had any clue what had happened to her. And the only witness they had to rely on was Nelson, the proprietor of the rooming house, which would turn out to be a very tough preposition for authorities to deal with over a fairly long period of time. They gathered up, I guess what you'd call the usual suspects, put them into lineups for Bertha Nelson to take a look at. This initial rush of people, she couldn't identify any of them as the man that she had seen renting the room, who, by all accounts, dismissing some wild, strange alternative story, whoever rented the room, wherever this guy was, he was the killer. Now, before processing forth into the meat and bones of this case, I just wanted to address where it happened and kind of what I'm theorizing about what happened. Now, when I got the address of the old rooming house, it put it a little bit off Mississippi this way, but still kind of implied it was roughly where this parking lot is here. So the idea might be that, there was a building that existed here a long time ago. This, as 108 years ago, a building could have easily been demolished here. It wouldn't be the first in this area that would have gotten demolished. However, I did notice something that makes me wonder if it was this building actually right here that's still standing today. This is called, the original name of this building was McKay Block, and it fits the style of the building that Barbara Holzman was found in. The first level is businesses, the next 2 stories up, probably apartment space today, maybe for the proprietors of the businesses below, but fits the standard of what a rooming house with businesses below it would be like back then. McKay Block existed in 1911, so it would have been here when Barbara Holzman was murdered. And you know, it's always possible when you get addresses, you know, I'm relying on Google Maps to place addresses, and every now and then an address can be off by 20, 30, 50 feet. So I put it smack dab in the middle of this driveway, but I'm thinking it might have been in this building, and here's why. So I was thinking if there was a rooming house here where this lot is, it would have been butted up right against McKay Block right here. But this building was at least 2 or 3 stories tall, and I noticed there's this very old ghost signage that even back in like the 60s and 70s was pretty faded. And ghost signs were pretty popular in just the first few, like, you know, even pre-1900 to like the early 1900s. It's very likely that when Barbara Holzman murdered, this ghost sign was here. So, I mean, if you look at it, how could this ghost sign have been here if there was even just a 2-story rooming house where this parking lot is? Because it would have been going into the ghost sign. They literally would have not been able to put this ghost sign here if there was a 2 or 3-story building here. This only suggests, if anything, that maybe a 1-story building was here at one time and took up space against the brick wall right here. So I really don't see it at all likely that there was another building here, and that likely McKay Block here was where that event occurred. That's my conclusion. And so begins this kind of digression that spanned for years. The police, as early as March 16th, literally the following day, thought they had a lead when it was discovered that there was a man who had been chasing around and trying to lure a 15-year-old girl away with him. And this happened on Fremont and Union Street, which was literally only like a couple blocks from where Barbara Holzman had been living. So it seemed like there was this idea that there were, to use a contemporary term, creepers in the area. But the first person who really got authorities' attention was apprehended March 26th, so about 11 days after Barbara Holzman's murder. And he was a guy named George Brown, who authorities felt generally matched the description of the individual that Bertha Nelson, the rooming house proprietor, the general description that she gave, which wasn't really all that much to go on, but it was enough for them to be suspicious about him. And when they brought him in for questioning, you know, they determined he was kind of this meandering, wandering alcoholic, and some of his info didn't quite match up. He implied that he had been, you know, working in Salem, and he'd been working with this woman up until a couple days before Barbara Holzman's death. But then when they asked him what he was doing when he first learned about it, he said that he was in Salem with this person that he said he hadn't been with on that day. So there were some mix-ups in his story. It got him just enough attention for the authorities to follow up on it. But then when they presented him to Bertha Nelson, he was just another guy that she said, no, this isn't the guy. So then months go by without any real solid suspects coming into attention. And it seems almost by accident, December 1911, so it's now been like 9 months since Barbara Holzman's murder. There's a guy named, and I'm probably going to botch his name, but he was named Leon Lockhart. First name spelled Leond, last name Lochard. So I'm going with Leon Lockhart. I'll just call him Lockhart to keep it simple. This guy had a criminal record. He'd been committing petty crime, burglaries in the Portland area. And by the time he came under suspicion for Barbara Holzman's murder in December of 1911, he was serving time at the Kelly Butte jail, which I discussed in my really long thing called, I don't remember what it's called, but I talk about the history of Kelly Butte and the fact that there was a jail up there that they used prisoners for manual labor. I discussed that in there. So this guy was up there chiseling rock out of the butte to pave the streets of the city, which is what all the prisoners there were being used for the most part. But the way he found himself into prison for his crimes wasn't that he got caught in the act or anything, but it was he apparently had a little bit of an issue with a former colleague, friend, adversary, I guess at this point. And apparently his friend poisoned his food and almost killed him, so he had to be rushed to the hospital. And when he was in the hospital, he was identified for who he was, and they arrested him afterwards, like, oh, you're this criminal we've been looking for. And he came under suspicion then for Barbara Holzman's murder. And one of the main things that drew attention to this guy was his boss, who his boss said the moment he heard the story about Barbara Holzman dying in this area, the old Albina area, he immediately thought that Lockhart was the guilty party. And so this guy's main reason for thinking Lockhart was the guy was when Lockhart worked for this gentleman, he was doing soliciting work. And he said that his area where he did soliciting, I don't know if it meant like door-to-door solicitation, trying to sell stuff out of a suitcase, I don't know. But he worked this Albina area, so he was here frequently. He would have been, if he was working, probably in this general area when Barbara Holzman was out. So he would have been in the area potentially to grab her. But what really struck his former boss was that right after Barbara Holzman turned up dead, he said Lockhart just dropped the job and stopped soliciting in this area. He pretty much made himself scarce in this area in the immediate aftermath of Barbara Holzman turning up dead. And the newspapers, as they did, and still sometimes do, the newspapers got really carried away with it, and they immediately started reporting, oh, we've got our guy, he's in jail already, and Bertha Nelson has already identified him as the guy. And then, as you see this, Nelson identifies Barbara Holzman's killer, you would see sometimes in the same newspaper articles, you would see them say, well, she said the guy kinda looked like him. So the newspapers ran with it, probably got the locals all worked up, but in the end, she would deny that he was the guy. So another guy scratched off. And here's an interesting thing, and this happened with multiple people that were brought up under suspicion. Police kind of moved forward on Lockhart for a while, but then kind of shied away from him. But one of the things they noticed was that Lockhart, again, knew this area really well, and they said that he frequented the building where the rooming house was that Barbara Holzman was found in. There was apparently a barber shop there that he would go to. So he not only knew this area, he knew the specific building. Now, the man I just mentioned earlier, George Brown, who was dismissed as a suspect, he, was a Portlander, but he knew this area so well that, and in particular the building, that when he made an acquaintance who was looking around to purchase or lease a building to open up a saloon, Brown specifically suggested a vacant space to try to, buy and open a saloon in, and that vacant space was in that same building where Barbara Holzman was found dead. So both these guys not only had suspicious, all these suspicions around them that made you think maybe these were the killers, but they both had direct connections to the specific building where the murder victim turned up. So Lockhart ends up being a dead end. We have to fast forward to January 1914. It's been almost 3 years and still nobody has even been charged, really. for this crime. It's lingering unsolved. The trail's getting cold. And interestingly, there's a guy by the name of Little, Lytle, is his last name. He gets busted in Nebraska for essentially trying to grab and snag a 8-year-old girl off the street. So she screamed, got the attention of a lot of people in the area, and all these people start flooding to the scene because they're well aware of what this guy's trying to do. And there's this story reported in the newspaper about how all these people showed up and they were going to lynch this guy for trying to attack and probably assault a little girl. And local authorities show up and they barely get this guy out of there before he gets hung, like in the town square or whatever. They barely get the guy away. But it's learned that in March 1911, this guy just happened to be in, of all places, Portland, Oregon. So you have a guy seemingly committing a similar crime. I guess the girl was only a couple years older than Barbara Holzman was, and he was in Portland at the time of the crime. So he came under suspicion for a while, and I had a hard time finding out what about this guy convinced authorities he wasn't the man, because it seems the trail regarding this guy went cold the moment that the police became suspicious of him as the guy. Fast forward even more. It's now February 1915, and we have another new suspect in the mix, a guy named O.C. Hyatt. And it seems in the case of this Hyatt gentleman, it seems like the police were just desperate. We're now pushing almost 4 years since Barbara Holzman's death. Nobody's taken the fall for it. And so they needed to find someone to take the fall for it. I'm sure the public was all over them about this. How do you let the murder of a 5-year-old girl go unsolved this long? And so they grabbed this guy, O.C. Hyatt. He's in his 60s. He's kind of this rundown old man. So, I mean, I guess he fits the age. But essentially what happens is apparently the police fill the guy up with booze to try to get him to start talking. Doesn't really lead anywhere. He says he wasn't even in Oregon. He was in Washington when the murders happened. And it became pretty clear that this guy wasn't the guy, and the police were just using crooked tactics to try to get somebody to confess to it. And in the end, this guy was also taken to Bertha Nelson to try to identify, and he said he wasn't the guy. It was like a total waste of time. So we go ahead to March 4th, 1915, and it seems the closest to the real deal that the police would discover in this case was a guy named Charles Kerrigan, who also was, I think in his 60s by this point. He would have probably looked elderly to Bertha Nelson back in 1911. He's grabbed, he's shown to Bertha Nelson. She says he looks a lot like the guy. She looks more like the guy she saw than anybody else that they had brought before to this point. But it is important to remember that it's 4 years later, and this woman, Bertha Nelson, is relying on a few glances she took at a man who came in, got a room, and then vanished at some point. So it's really hard to say, it's really hard to trust anybody's recollection at this point, but that was what Bertha Nelson said, that Charles Kerrigan matched most of the guy that she saw check out a room in this building. And Kerrigan would also be the only person who would actually be tried for the crime, but then he'd be acquitted. So the authorities were back to square one yet again. And finally, the last suspect I was able to stumble onto in all of my searching came in 1927. So we're talking 16 years after. And there was a guy that came under suspicion named John Pender, and he couldn't have been under suspicion long because it seems his name popped up in the papers and then he disappeared. And even years after this Pender guy came under suspicion, there were still reports coming out saying Barbara Holzman's crime had been unsolved. So obviously this Pender guy, whether he did it or not, was not convicted of the crime. I don't even know if he went to trial for it. But essentially, he was busted in 1927 for trying to attack a young girl. So again, it comes under suspicion. If he did it now in 1927, who's to say he didn't do it back in 1911? And he actually went to prison because in 1911, the same year that Barbara Holzman vanished, he had murdered somebody. So obviously this guy had a pretty serious taste for crime and had killed another person in the same year, at least within months of when Barbara Holzman was killed. So it'd be hard to put murder past this guy, but for whatever reason, he, it seems like he likely didn't even stay as a significant suspect. Maybe he had an alibi, maybe he was in another part of Oregon, he wasn't in this area specifically in March 1911. I really don't know, because it seems attention was put on him and then the reports just stopped. So the horrible tragedy of the whole thing is, even after that 16-year span of stumbling onto all these possible suspects, one of whom may still have been the guy. I mean, who's to say? It's very possible that one of these guys was. I don't know. I'm suspicious about the Lockhart guy. Why did he suddenly stop doing his job in this area the moment Barbara Holzman died? This Brown guy, gentleman named Brown, you know, he knew this area too well. I mean, there's reason to be suspicious about a lot of these people. And it seemed the further on down the road we got, the less viable these suspects became. And the sad truth is, whatever your theories are, whatever way you shake it, the murder of 5-year-old Barbara Holzman on March 15th, 1911 lingers today in 2019 as an unsolved crime. And with how much time has gone by, it seems pretty unlikely that we are ever going to have a resolution to this crime. However, you know, cold cases, 60, 70, 80 years old. I want to say that even in the last year, there was a cold case from like the late 1800s that had been solved or something. So it's not impossible, but it doesn't seem likely that Barbara Holzman is ever going to receive the justice that she really does deserve in one of the most horrifying, tragic murders and unsolved murders in the history of this big old city. Being perpetrated on a 5-year-old girl who was just trying to run an errand to the store. But, you know, that does remind us of a lesson that we try to keep near and dear to our hearts today, which is don't let your little kids just wander off. You know, you can have your child snatched out of your front yard. You know, go to the mall, take your eye off your kid for 10 seconds, someone can grab him and vanish into the crowd. Take care of your kids, people, because just because this was 1911 and maybe we aren't as lackadaisical about, you know, the amount of responsibility we give our children in a world where they can easily be attacked and abducted and lost forever. You know, we just have to take care of our kids. I was starting to lose my train of thought there, but that's what it all comes down to, is taking care of your children, because just because it was 1911 doesn't mean something similar can't happen today. You know, that's the moral of this whole thing. And I hope, against the odds, that someday there will be some resolution, some new suspect, some new something, someone who's still alive today whose grandfather knew who did it, or whose so-and-so uncle's best friend admitted to it but never told the police, something like that, anything to resolve this matter. I hope that comes. But till then, we're left with a horribly tragic unsolved mystery. And with that said, thank you so much for watching this video. This one was, you know, really got a hold of me as I was going through all the old information and newspaper articles and going in depth into this and just seeing how horrid this crime was, like the murder, strangulation of a little child. And that said, remember guys, as always, like, share, subscribe, comment if you choose. Hit up my Patreon if you want to help me that way. And till next time, guys, again, thank you for watching. This has been Steve the Amateur Historian with another episode of Historic Murders of Portland.